Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 13th of January of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the results of Russian missile strikes that took place during the previous 24 hours. As you know, the Russians were using different types of weapons. They started with drones by Geran, then the Russians launched different types of missiles, and they finished their missile strikes with the Kinzhal. And as a result of those attacks, the Russians managed to destroy a significant number of military facilities, plants, and so on. But we were expecting for the Ukrainian report, because usually the Ukrainians are saying that they are able to shut down almost 99% of every single missile or drones the Russians are launching. But when talking about today, according to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the Ukrainians managed to shut down just 8 missiles of 37 that were launched from the Russian side. So probably this is the poorest result of Ukrainian air defense work since the beginning of the special military operation. And I have just a few questions whether the Ukrainians were so successful before, or before they were lying and now they just try to show the real picture. Very interesting situation. Anyway, no matter regarding the results, regarding the numbers, the situation is getting worse and worse. And as if you remember, just right before the previous video, we were talking that the main purpose of Russian attacks that took place, let's say, during the previous 24 hours, where the Russian strikes were aimed mainly at destroying Ukrainian air defense system. And as I understand, the Russians managed to do this. Furthermore, during the day we got a few pictures, geolocated videos of the results of those strikes. We see somewhere in Sumy area some city, and right in the central part of the city we see a very powerful, very big, let's say, explosion and results, lots of ruins. So this is probably the only geolocation we have just during the previous day. Now we are moving to the situation on the ground, and first we're going to talk about Synkivka area, about this city. If you remember, during the previous months, December and January, the Russians were trying to attack the Ukrainians, and we had a lots of questions about that attack. What was the real Russian plans, what exactly they were trying to achieve, because the Russians launched at least 3 or 4 waves, and always they were using the same gates. They were trying to enter Synkivka along these lines, and always, all the time, the Russians were defeated by the Ukrainians. So the question is, and we have even a special analysis from some Russian military experts where they were asking themselves what was the purposes of the Russians attacks in this direction. And probably today we got, let's say, detailed answer to that question. Today the Russian sources published the video of a significant number of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces, not just in Synkivka but also in the city that located to the south, so everywhere in Kupinsk's direction. And according to this video, we see that the Russians during the previous few days managed to destroy a significant number of Ukrainian armored vehicles, tanks, personnel carriers, just regular trucks, evacuation machines. All of them were destroyed, and as I understand, the things that the Russians were trying to achieve by those attacks to Synkivka were to force the Ukrainians to send as many as possible forces, as much as possible forces to the combat line. So you know that let's say, just for your understanding, for example, this is the front line, this is the combat line, and this is the combat line from Ukrainian side, and let's assume that this is the combat line from the Russian side. So you might ask, and you might have some question, how many forces do the Russians and the Ukrainians try to keep along this red and yellow line every single day? And you will be surprised if you find out that, for example, let's say on the northern part of Synkivka, let's say in this area, I will not be surprised if the Ukrainians keep their, let's say, 20 soldiers. So let's say during the on the daily basis, just 20 soldiers, and that's it. And the same number of forces keeps the Russians. And always when the Russians, either the Russians or Ukrainians attacks, the opposite side try to bring as many as possible reserves to slow down or to repel this or that attack. This is normal tactic, because if you concentrate and if you keep lots of forces along the combat line, these forces will be destroyed or reduced by FPV drone strikes. So when when the Russians attacked the northern part of Synkivka, the Ukrainians were forced to send there lots of armored vehicles, tanks and infantry somewhere from Kupiansk as close as possible to the combat line. And of course, Ukrainians were forced to stretch their forces along this line, and after the Russians, according to most of the videos, were defeated, they stepped back to the north in direction of Liman I, and after that the part of the drones started, and the Ukrainians of course discovered their own positions, and after that, as a result of FPV drone strikes and artillery strikes, most of the armored vehicles that were redeployed, let's say from Kupiansk to the combat line, were destroyed. So that was a part, or at least some, let's say, purposes and goals of the Russians when talking about the battle for Synkivka. Currently, we can't say that the Ukrainians won the battle or managed to achieve significant results, but anyway, we can't either say that the situation is very bad and difficult for them. We need more time, and after probably a few days and or maybe weeks, we're going to receive more results and more attempts to attack from the Russian side. Now we're moving to Liman direction. We have lots of interesting details and updates, and most of them are coming from Torske salient, from this area. And there were no offensives, no attacks from the Russian side, but we see something like concentration of FPV drone strikes from the Ukrainian side on this area. And as you can see, there are at least 3 geolocations in this area. All of them were published today. Maybe some of them took place a week ago, maybe yesterday, but the most important is the concentration of Ukrainian fire. So that means that the Russians, once again, nobody, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, are keeping significant number of forces on the combat line. 20, 15, 10, maybe 5 soldiers, and that's it. And the main purpose of this, let's say, is not a security group, we can say this like an emergency group, is to hold and to stay, let's say, for the first 2 or 5 hours. This is the most important job of any forces. And during this period of time, the reinforcement should arrive from the mainland. So, but if we see a concentration of fire like we can see today in Torske salient, that means that the Russians took a decision to concentrate additional forces on this area, and there is only one reason why this or that side are concentrating forces on this or that front line. That means that the Russians have some plans. And we, of course, we understand what plans the Russians have, because the Russians are very close to the Zhiribets river and to the village by the name of Torske. So probably during the next few days, probably after 15th of January, the Russians will launch or renew their offensive operation further to the west, trying to completely cut and split this area in 2 parts, because there are not the distance is not so big, and there are just maybe a few kilometers left for the Russians to get the, let's say, the western edge of Torske and Zhiribets river. So the concentration of forces tell us that very soon the Russians will renew their offensive operation, and they will try to capture and to split this territory in 2 parts, because this is the weakest point of Ukrainian defense. They have like strong positions in Krynky forest, they have more or less strong positions to the north in the vicinity of Terny, but their positions along Torske is the weakest, because the distance is very short, and there are it's very difficult to support and supply Ukrainian forces in this area. Obviously, the Russians will try to use this situation in their favor. Now we are moving to Bakhmut Artyomov's direction. We have lots of very interesting details and updates from this territory, and the most important one is that, according to the Russian sources, they managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt in the vicinity of Klishchiivka, and the Russians, as a result of a very fierce clashes, managed to establish control over additional trenches on the strongholds. As I understand, the Russians managed to bypass this area and to establish control over this forest. For now, we still haven't received any geolocated video confirmations, but very likely the Russians captured this territory, this stronghold and the forest around this area. And if it's true, if we're gonna receive some additional confirmations, then the Russians will be able to continue offensive operation further in Ivanovska, and furthermore the Russians will be able to continue offensive operation towards the next defense belt that located to the west of 215.7 hill. Furthermore, the Russians published few videos of Lancet strikes in the same area. They were trying, first of all, before any attack, they were trying to suppress Ukrainian artillery positions, mortar positions. Of course, they managed to do this, and that allowed the Russians to, let's say, reduce the artillery support from the Ukrainian side. Because furthermore, not just artillery support, we know that Ukrainians have a lack of artillery rounds or artillery shells, and the ratio in comparison with the Russians is 1-5. And if even if you have this ratio 1-5, but if you don't have artillery systems, sometimes the ratio on this or that front line gets from 1-5 till 1-10, and of course this is much worse and much difficult situation. When talking about northern direction, we haven't received anything, just very interesting activity we can find in the vicinity to the north of Privilye and Golubovka, somewhere in the vicinity of Dubrova and Fedorovka Drugaya. According to information we have, the Russians on this area managed to discover another Ukrainian artillery position, and as a result of Lancet strike, they managed to discover first of all and then to destroy this artillery position. What is so important, the thing is that if we increase the numbers of updates for the previous few days, let's say since the beginning of January, we're gonna see that this is not the first artillery strike. Just during the previous few weeks, the Russians almost at the same area managed to destroy up to 2 artillery systems. So these are 2 different videos. On this video we see M77 howitzer. This howitzer was destroyed on the 9th of January, and the artillery system we discussed previous video was destroyed, let's say, today or yesterday. So we see some certain Russian concentration to artillery system were destroyed, and probably the Russians do have some certain plans in this area to continue offensive operation either in direction of Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, in direction of Grigorovka, or probably to continue the battle for Bogdanovka. When talking about Bogdanovka, we haven't received anything about any Russian further progress. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area, and we have lots of very interesting videos and, let's say, geolocations. But before we start, the Russian sources published unique footage of Tornado S strike. This is Russian analog of HIMARS. This system can attack for another up to probably 300 kilometers, and the Russians were using this type of weapon to attack the Ukrainian headquarters, if you remember, on Kamyanska direction, Zaporozhye area of Ukrainian 128th Mountain Assault Brigade headquarters. There were few strikes, and all of them were resultative, and lots of so this is one of the most important powerful multi-launch rocket system that the Russians have, and they just published the video of another strike somewhere, maybe in Donetsk direction or somewhere in Zaporozhye direction. Probably this missile got the target because this missile is self-navigated, and the Russians can correct and navigate this missile during the fly. So let's move back to Avdiivka, and as you can see, we have lots of geolocations somewhere in the vicinity of Stepova chemical plant, the eastern part of Avdiivka. Let's start with the eastern part. Different mappers have already updated their maps showing the Russian additional progress in this area. So according at least to Syriac map, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control over this territory. Yesterday we got the video of Russian attack, but according to that video, the Russians managed to bypass this area to enter this forest and this small village or residential area, and the Ukrainians created an ambush, and as a result of that ambush, most of the Russians lost the entire platoon or something like this. So I can't tell for sure whether the Russians control this area, but at least we're gonna keep this sector in the gray zone. Furthermore, the Russians continue publishing almost every single day more additional and more geolocated videos how they are bombing or were bombing the Ukrainian positions along around and along the chemical plant. On this video we see another strike with missile probably or artillery, and as a result of that strike, another Ukrainian stronghold or the checkpoint was destroyed. If we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of the month, we're gonna see additional strikes a little bit to the west from the original position. On this video we can see another strike from the Russian side. So as you can see, the Russians are bombing the edge northern positions in Avdiivka, which means that very likely the Russians do have some certain plans to attack further. Furthermore, when talking about Stepova itself, the Russians managed to establish control over almost around 90% of the village. We had the video during the day how the Ukrainian 3 Bradleys were attacking the Russian T-90 tank, and as a result of, let's say, very heavy fire, the Russian tank lost the battle and the Ukrainians won with 3 Bradleys. Just 1 Bradley was damaged, but even that damaged Bradley was managed to evacuate from the combat line. The Russians lost the T-90 tank, but anyway, this confirms some certain Russian progress in this area and that the Russians managed to dig in deeper in this area. And when talking about the previous 24 hours, the main clashes were taking place along this tree line. The Russians and the Ukrainians were fighting heavily for this area because this is like the final, let's say, checkpoint, the final objective either for the Russians and the Ukrainians to complete the battle for Stepova and to move their focus either further to Berdichi or to the south to the chemical plant. There was another clashes between Ukrainian Bradley and Russian infantry. The Ukrainians, as you can see, were attacking the Russian positions with machine gun, with automated machine gun on the Bradley, and this Bradley was running along this line from one side to another. Anyway, this video confirms either the Ukrainian positions and the Russian positions as well. So the Ukrainian Bradley was moving along this tree line. He was like moving from carousel from one side to another, and from these positions the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian forces somewhere in this direction, which also confirms some certain Russian progress on this territory. Furthermore, we got another Ukrainian video of FPV drone strike against the Russian infantry along this tree line. So we have a lot of geolocations that currently this is the main goal and the main area of main clashes for Stepova, and who wins the battle, then this side gonna receive some, let's say, bonuses and some benefits for further movements, let's say, to the west or to the south. When talking about the railways and the railways, let's say, block in this area, we have also a few geolocations how the Ukrainians were evacuating their own soldiers that were wounded as a result of clashes with the Russians, and we have another video of FPV drone strike against the Russian infantry also somewhere here. So like lots of FPV drone strikes, which means that some part of this territory is under Russian control and some part under Ukrainian. So we see that what kind of conclusions we can make as a result of this let's reviewing of this sector, that the clashes for Stepova has renewed because for a very long period of time the Russians were concentrating and were trying to keep their forces along the railways, and for a very long period of time they haven't been risking to leave this area and, let's say, to move further to the west, and these operational pauses have been taking place for the previous 2 or even 3 weeks, and now we see that the Russians renewed their offensive operation with much heavy power, a heavier less pressure, and now they're moving either to Berdichi along the village, and also the Russians are moving to the south in direction of the chemical plant. So we'll see whether the Russians are able to do and to achieve anything right now, but the level of pressure tell us that the battles are very strong and the Russians are planning not just to capture this territory but to get even further and deeper inside the Ukrainian defense belt. Furthermore, we got some geolocations of FPV drones strikes on this area. And by the way, as you can see, the Russians renewed their offensive operation in the direction of Stepova only after they managed to dig in deeper and to create few lines of defense exactly on this point. So maybe that was the reason why the Russians stopped any activity in direction of Berdichi and Stepova. They just tried to secure this area, and now they have managed to do this. We have a lot of geolocation confirmations of that, and after they secured the flank, they renewed their pressure further to the west from Stepova to Berdichi and the strongholds around this area. So we'll see how this round of clashes will be finished. Furthermore, the Russians continue pressure against the Ukrainian forces on the western, the southern part, just regular FPV drone bombings, FPV drone strikes. When the main purpose of these attacks is to slow down the Ukrainians, to destroy as many as possible of their assets and their materials, and more or less the Russians are pretty effective on this direction. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Marinka and Novomykhailovka. We have a lot of updates when talking about Georgievka. The clashes and the storming process of this territory continues. The Russians published another video how they were tracking and trying to discover the Ukrainian positions in the village, and after that, after they managed to track this or that position, they were bombing this area heavily, so which confirms that just a regular military routine in this area has started. So it will take obviously not even a week, it will maybe take even a month while the Russians will do this artillery stuff, and maybe after that they will start moving, or they will do this like at the same time. From one side they're going to bomb, from another side they're going to move from different directions. And I'll remind you that according to main geolocations, the Russians are trying to move along the northern part of Georgievka due to the complete absence of any strongholds exactly along this line. When talking about Novomykhailovka, the clashes on this area continues. According to some Russian sources, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to improve their positions and they managed to capture these, let's say, 3 lines, and not just capture, let's say there are like few phases of any territory progress to enter, to capture, to dig in deeper, and to create 100% control. So if we just measure this area for these 4 stages, we can say that the Russians managed to dig in deeper, let's say the final stage of any control over any territory. But the Ukrainian sources published the video on how they were bombing and attacking the Russian forces, Russian tanks, Russian armored vehicles, personnel carriers that were moving to the strongholds, these main strongholds. This is the first one, and this is the second one. Significant number of those armored vehicles were destroyed, but the Russians, by the time the armored vehicles were destroyed, managed to abandon them and to enter or maybe even capture the trenches in the vicinity of this territory. Anyway, so if we compare these two sectors, probably this one is under complete Russian control, but this one is the territory that the Russians managed to enter. Now they need to repel obviously upcoming Ukraine counteroffensives, and after that we can say that this territory is also under Russian control. And as you can see, the situation is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians. We are receiving almost every single day more and more geolocations of Russian progress, and very likely this territory might collapse very soon. Once again, there are 2 strongholds, and if any of them falls, then the entire situation can turn in unpredictable direction. When talking about Novomykhailovka itself, today the Russian sources published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in the farms with FPV drones. This is, let's say, the first normal, more or less, let's say, reliable confirmation that the Russians not just leave this territory, but that Ukrainians either managed to restore complete control, and currently they control this area not just, let's say, with fire, artillery, and so on. They control this territory with the soldiers, and we will adjust the map, and according to this geolocation, obviously the Ukrainians restore control completely over this territory, and we will update the map before the next video. So this area is under Ukrainians, there is no doubts about this, and we have everything for this. Now we are moving to Salotsky Novomykhailovka area, and as we discussed in the previous videos, the Ukrainians, according to some Russian sources, were forced to step back, and they left another number of fields, and they were forced to move further to the Vadiana, to the line of 524. So according to lots of sources, the Ukrainians left this territory. And this is very interesting because we don't have a lot of geolocations that can confirm this information, but as I understand, we need to wait a little bit. The Russians published just one video how they were bombing the Ukrainian forces with Torske flamethrower system. Maybe the Ukrainians don't have any counter Torske flamethrower system weapon or equipment. They don't know how to fight with the Russian pressure, and the only thing they can do is to move further to the west and to withdraw their position. positions. So we'll see anyway, we will adjust the map and we will turn this territory in the gray zone. And once again, according to a lot of very reliable, more or less reliable resources, the Russians continue advancing and they managed to force the Ukrainians to step back. Once again, this is also very important and very interesting direction that allows the Russians to get closer to the 0524 road and to cut and to break the Ukrainian logistic in this area. So Novomikhailivka once again is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians, the situation in this area. When talking about Bradley Square, we haven't received anything from this direction. Obviously, the clashes continues. We have updated the map to the west of Verbova because we have geolocations that the Russians managed to storm and capture this territory. Obviously, the Russians will continue pressure, but they're not like trying to be very fast, very slowly, very accurate, step by step, and trying to reduce the level of losses from their side. At Krynky, we have just few updates, and to be more precise, we have just one geolocated video from the Ukrainian side, how the Ukrainian was filming the situation around his stronghold. As you can see, he is like in underground in something like a trenches, and he was filming the situation around him. And as you can see, nothing left from the city, even ruins. It reminds me like, I don't know, post-apocalypse I don't know, video or something like this, but there are still Ukrainians. Regarding the situation, regarding the losses, the Ukrainians are still there and they still control the foothold in Krynky. So we'll see what is going to be next. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces with Lancet. A significant number of artillery positions, artillery forces were destroyed, but as you can see, there is no progress in Krynky. So we'll see what is going to be next. And before we finish the video, we got another act of democracy from Ukraine, somewhere from the western part. On this video, we can see a few more Ukrainian recruiters who were capturing and holding the Ukrainian civilians in the street and trying to get them inside of some cars and trying to send them to Avdiivka or something like this. The important part from this video is that there are more and more women in Ukraine who try to fight with these recruiters because there are no law and no obligations, at least let's say 100% obligations from the Ukrainian side that can force women to serve in Ukraine army. So that's why they can feel themselves pretty free because they know that there are no risk to fight with these people and because they can't capture them. And this is very important because every single day we see that women in Ukraine are getting stronger and stronger positions. And I'm not saying anything, but if there are going to be military coup or any coup in Ukraine, obviously women will be in charge of this process. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.